Charles V and Anne's arch-enemy would finally conclude that everyone besides Smeaton was condemned upon presumption and certain indications without valid proof or confession. Another set of historians have favoured the explanation that Anne was the victim of a conspiracy by Thomas Cromwell and a court faction involving the Seymours. This rests upon a view of Henry as a pliable king whose courtiers could bounce him into action and tip him by a crisis into rejecting Anne. But why should Anne and Cromwell, erstwhile allies of a reformist bent, fall out? Differences of opinion are thought to have risen over the use of funds from the dissolution of the monasteries, as well as matters of foreign policy, seemingly slender motives for destroying a queen. It has been suggested that Cromwell's court faction intended to replace Anne with Jane Seymour. Chabois mentioned Jane in a letter of the 10th of February 1536, reporting that Henry had sent her a gift of a purse full of sovereigns, accompanied by a letter. She did not open the letter, which Ives speculated contained a summons to the royal bed. Instead, she kissed it and returned it, asking the messenger to tell the king that there was no treasure in this world that she valued as much as her honour, and that if the king wanted to give her a present, she begged it might be at such a time as God would be pleased to send her some advantageous marriage. Now, this picture here is a woodcut depicting Anne's coronation in 1533. Her marriage to Henry has been described as a tumultuous relationship of sunshine and storms. Such a calculated reply is reminiscent of Anne during the days of her courtship with Henry. In response to Jane's coyness, Henry's love for her was said to have marvellously increased, yet she was described as a lady whom the king serves, a telling word implying that he sought her as his courtly love mistress. There is little evidence that, before Anne was accused of adultery, Henry had planned to make Jane his wife. Marriage to Jane was surely a symptom and a product of Anne's downfall, not a cause. The pivotal piece of evidence for a conspiracy is a remark made by Cromwell to Chabois after Anne's death. In a letter to Charles V, Chabois wrote that Cromwell had told him he set himself to devise and conspire the said affair, suggesting that Cromwell plotted against Anne. Crucially, however, this phrase is often used out of context. The previous sentence states that he himself, Cromwell, had been authorised and commissioned by the king to prosecute and bring to an end the mistress's trial, to do which he had taken considerable trouble. If we accept this account, it is impossible to dismiss Henry VIII from the picture. Cromwell claimed not to be acting alone. assertions about the doomed state of Henry and Anne's relationship, even at the height of their happiness, in late summer 1533. But Chabois himself recognised that Henry and Anne had always been prone to lovers' quarrels, and that the king's character was very changeable. True, Henry and Anne were direct with each other. They got angry, shouted, and became jealous, but they were also frequently described as being merry together. It was an epithet still being applied to them during the autumn of 1535, and one that was appended to their marriage more often than to any of Henry's other unions. Bernard has described theirs as a tumultuous relationship of sunshine and storms. Some have proposed that the miscarriage of a male fetus suffered by Anne in January 1536 led inexorably to her downfall. Did it cause Henry to believe that Anne would never be able to bear him an heir, and thus to consider the marriage doomed? Certainly the king was reported to have shown great disappointment and sorrow. Chabois wrote that Henry, during his visit to Anne's chamber after the tragedy, said very little except, "I see that God will not give me male children." Henry then left Anne at Greenwich to convalesce while he went to Whitehall to mark the feast day of St. Matthew. Chabois rather maliciously interpreted this as showing that Henry had abandoned Anne, whereas in former times he could hardly be 1 hour without her. Clearly, the miscarriage was a great blow to both Henry and Anne. Yet another 4 months were to pass before Anne's death, so demonstrating a direct link between the events would be problematic. Another story, reported third-hand by Chabois, quotes Henry as telling an unidentified courtier that he had married Anne, seduced and constrained by sortilèges. That last word translates as sorcery, spells, charms, and has given rise to the suggestion that Anne Boleyn dabbled in witchcraft. That this is regularly cited as one of the charges of which she was found guilty, it is not mentioned in the indictment. Ives, though, pointed out that the primary English meaning of sortilèges at this time was divination, a translation that changes the meaning of Henry's comment. It could imply that he was induced to marry Anne by premarital prophecies that she would bear sons, or could refer simply to Henry's earlier infatuation or bewitchment by Anne. The idea that Henry had been seduced by witchcraft has become attached to another theory, which holds that the real reason for Anne's ruin was that the fetus miscarried in January 1536 was deformed. According to Tudor specialist Retha Warnick, the delivery of a shapeless mass of flesh proved in Henry's mind that Anne was both a witch and adulterously promiscuous. But this description comes from a Catholic propagandist, Nicholas Sander, writing 50 years later. There is no contemporary evidence to sustain this salacious theory. Diplomatic coup. An event in April 1536 suggests that just weeks before Anne was executed, Henry was still committed to his marriage. In the early months of 1536, Henry was increasing the pressure on Charles V to recognise Anne as his wife. On the 18th of April, he invited Chabois to the court. Events that day were very deliberately staged. The ambassador attended Mass, and as Henry and Anne descended from the royal pew to the chapel, she stopped and bowed at Chabois. Etiquette dictated that he return the gesture, a significant diplomatic coup, because it implied recognition by the ambassador, and by extension his emperor. charged, reckless and arguably fatal, useful ammunition of Cromwell, if Cromwell were looking for dirt? Was it, as Greg Walker, author of Writing Under Tyranny, has suggested, not what Anne did, but what she said that made her appear guilty? When it comes to Anne Boleyn's fall, historians give their best guess answers.